Hello there, welcome to the channel and this video about Hugh from Star Trek, the Borg Drone who was liberated and then rejoined and then liberated again from the Borg Collective to become one of the more interesting characters Star Trek have ever created, and quite nuanced to be fair. He would even be reappearing in the Star Trek Picard series more recently. But before we get started with this, if you like this video or any others on the channel, please like, share and subscribe. I also have a second channel called Nerd.World Films, a bit more specialised in this one, where I focus on movies rather than such a broad range of topics like this channel is. There's a link in the description below, or possibly on a little button somewhere, I don't know, if I remember. If you like those videos on that channel, there's not too many there right now, but if you like them, please like, share and subscribe over there. With that said, let's get this started. Hugh would first come to the attention of the Federation and Starfleet in 2368 when a Borg scout ship crashed on a planet in the Argolis sector, which Hugh was the only known survivor. Although critically injured, he was recovered by the crew of the Enterprise D, who would return him to the Enterprise for medical attention. Hugh was now severed from the Collective and would have his first taste of individuality. Now, unlike other Borg drones we see separated from the Collective, such as Jean-Luc Picard when he became Locutus, and very more notably would be 7 of 9, they all retained some knowledge of their past lives, and, for example, their name. Picard still knew he was called Jean-Luc Picard. 7 of 9 would know she was known as Annika Hansen, although she wouldn't really go by the name. Hugh was given the name after striking up a friendship with the chief engineer of the Enterprise, Geordi LaForge, being given the name Hugh, almost as a joke, as they kept calling him Hugh. Hugh, it is inferred then, or can be inferred, was assimilated at a very young age, an age where perhaps before he knew what his name was, or that name simply was erased by the Collective as unnecessary data. But still, it's more likely he was assimilated perhaps as young as an infant, as Annika Hansen was assimilated as a child but old enough to know her name. He must have been so young he didn't know it, or his brain was unable to retain that information, or perhaps it didn't survive the maturation process. It's not really clear. It's also unknown what species Hugh is, as he's never actually identified. It's likely if he was human, the crew of the Enterprise may have either made more attempts to save him from the Borg, or perhaps an attempt to identify him. But as they didn't, he probably isn't human. At this time, the Federation was still rather afraid of the Borg. They were something of a mysterious enemy that they couldn't understand. They were unlike any species they'd ever encountered before. I mean, these things assimilate whole worlds. Death to them is irrelevant, resistance is futile, you name it. They were unlike anything that the Federation had ever really encountered. They'd only heard about them in rumour and whisper before this, and most probably didn't even believe they were real, something like the space boogeyman most likely, as evidenced by the Hansen family's rather adventurous investigation of the Borg around this time period. As a result, Starfleet would hatch a plan to use Hugh as a living weapon against the Borg, get him re-assimilated and introduce basically an algorithm into the Borg that would cause chaos and possibly the destruction of the Borg, which some could argue was an act of genocide if necessary, perhaps, and so they considered it self-preservation, although ultimately they wouldn't go through with this plan because they realized that Hugh was an individual and had rights and all those other lovely Federation values. They decided to not go through with it. Might have been different if it was picked up by a Section 31 vessel, but he wasn't. He was picked up by the Enterprise and its ultra-moral crew. So Hugh would ultimately willingly return to the Borg Collective, as those were his people. It's all he'd ever known, and he didn't show a great deal of desire to remain independent of them. Although, again, this could have been a lack of understanding on the Federation's part as to how effectively mentally enslaved person becomes when they are assimilated by the Borg, particularly at a young age. You can see it with 7 of 9. She was raised by the Borg. She grew up with the Borg. She wasn't afraid of them. She saw them as her family, her people. She didn't see herself as human. Even after she was liberated, even after she began to embrace her humanity, she always remembered her Borg heritage. the Borg were not evil. They were no more evil than a virus. In fact, they could be attributed to being a lot like a virus, in that they're an invasive species, certainly, but they're not necessarily callous or malicious. They're simply are. Anyway, Hugh would return, but his sense of individuality would begin to infect the Borg, which was always something of an odd concept to me, because isn't every individual the Borg assimilate an individual before they become a drone? So why is all their not individuality affecting the Borg? Is it because he was already a Borg and they didn't think to erase it from him again? It's never really clear. Anyway, his reassimilation would result in the Borg on his cube, or whatever vessel it was. Perhaps this ship that we see was the vessel. It might not have been that heavily modified. That could have simply been a Borg vessel. We do see this design crop up again in an episode of Voyager, which the Borg intend to use as a type of bomb, not a ship, but the geometry is the same. So perhaps it was already an existing Borg design. We don't really know. Either way, those drones become independent. Most of, if not all of them, sever themselves from the collective, or get severed from the collective, more accurately. They then form a Borg colony and have the great misfortune to pick up Lore, who becomes their de facto leader, as these Borg want to become more machine than human, or organic, to put it more bluntly. Now, Lore is the worst person you could ever follow, and at some point in the future I'm probably going to do a video on him, because he was just amazing. He was the perfect juxtaposition for the character of Data. Regardless, getting off topic, stay on topic, the Borg. They forge a colony, and they come up with ideas to try and make themselves more mechanical by attaching more mechanical components. Not all the Borg are on board with this, and Hugh is one of them. This is all catalogued in the great two-parter of The Next Generation, The Descent. Now, eventually, the Borg, or these former Borg, rid themselves of Lore after Data and the Enterprise crew come and help it. Now, their ship is destroyed during all this, and a lot of them are clearly killed, but at the end of it, Hugh becomes their leader. Now, we don't really know what happens to the Borg who have been freed from the collective on this colony much after this. We don't know if they rejoin the collective or if they become something like the cooperative we see in the Delta Quadrant, making their own collective, but it's not likely, as when we next encounter Hugh many years later in the Beta Quadrant, he's had most of his Borg components removed and is now a free and fully functioning individual, and is clearly no longer the leader of that colony. It's also stated more accurately, that he is now a Federation citizen, so whether or not the Borg colony became a member of the Federation, or perhaps he was simply given Federation citizenship, is unknown. It's also never explained exactly how he got to the Alpha and Beta quadrants. It's assumed he probably came through the wormhole, but that would again imply that the wormhole was in range, coincidentally, of where that Borg colony was, and as we know, their main ship was destroyed. Did they have the resources to build another? Did they capture another? Did they were able to modify another ship to use it to get there? Was it transwarp capable? Who knows? More likely they came through the wormhole. Or at least he did, to help the other XBs aboard the artifact, where he became the director. He would then help Picard, a man that had previously helped him and helped his colony of other free Borg, really become free and understand what freedom meant, and was willing to help Picard in whatever he needed. He would then be very regrettably killed at the hands of Romulan agents, along with many of the other XBs, despite attempts to save them by Seven of Nine and others. Hugh ultimately, as I said, died aboard the artifact in 2399. Now, although his death was tragic, at least he had a heroic death that would be befitting of any Klingon. He would definitely be getting into Sto-Vo-Kor. Now, with that said, that's the end of a brief history and character biography of the XB Hugh, as he was known across Star Trek The Next Generation and Star Trek Picard. His character was very sympathetic and very interesting, and with that said, there's not really much more we can go into on this. I might retouch on some of these subjects in a later video, but for now, If you like this video, please like, share and subscribe, and please head over to my other channel, Nerd.World Films. Like, share and subscribe there too if you can. And thank you and bye bye.